Hey, Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, Beltway newsletters and corporate influence are on my radar this morning. Major corporations pay media outlets good money to advertise in their newsletters, which offer great access to niche groups of relevant insiders and power brokers. It's exactly the demographic for whom these companies need to massage their message. It's a win-win. Easy cash for media outlets devising ways to cope in the new economy, and targeted advertising for corporations who need goodwill in Washington. Axios, for instance, relies on Axios AM sponsorship from Amazon, MasterCard, Google, Facebook, Bank of America, and many, many more. Author Mike Allen notes the sponsorship in small print at the top of the email, then smoothly embeds ads for a company like Bank of America between those news items. While the ads are designed to resemble the news items, the process is fairly transparent and often provides useful insight into what major corporations are trying to tell Washington. While it's always worth remembering how some of these outlets' bread is buttered, from Politico to Axios to even here at The Hill, none of this is news, nor is it necessarily corrupt. Sponsorships at least actually provide some modicum of transparency, and a lot of good work is paid for by wealthy interests. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad, but it does mean that skepticism is always warranted. Washington is a shameless place, and corruption sometimes happens right in full public view. Just browse FARA filings on the DOJ's website for a few minutes and you'll see that very clearly. When the Washington Post goes easy on Jeff Bezos, we know why. This month, however, Politico's popular Playbook newsletter produced a particularly telling example of Beltway subterfuge. In a newsletter sponsored by Amazon, which is increasingly desperate for goodwill from lawmakers, Politico allowed the company to advertise a ranking from the Progressive Policy Institute, which named Amazon to the top of its investment heroes list, citing infrastructure investments and a $15 an hour starting wage. Well, in 2019, Fast Company reported, quote, Facebook, Google, and Amazon all donated last year to the Progressive Policy Institute, a pro-business think tank that regularly sponsors briefings for Democratic elected officials. In a June write-up on the Investment Heroes list, Bloomberg pushed PPI's chief economic strategist to concede the group receives, quote, general funding from some of the companies on the Heroes list. The methodology only uses publicly available data and a consistent procedure that can be replicated, he claimed. That's probably true. There are reasonable defenses of Amazon's economic impact in the aggregate, and there's no ethical problem with those pro-business ideologues on the left making those arguments. Like the symbiosis between Amazon and Politico, the relationship between Amazon and PPI is at least somewhat based on shared interests and shared ideology. I'm sure the economists at PPI genuinely see Amazon as a net positive engine of economic development. Indeed, the archive of Amazon-related posts on PPI's website is full of research defending the company. While we're at it, two things can be true. Amazon can give people decent wages and affordable goods, but do it in a really awful way. In fact, that is true. But consider the cycle here. Amazon funds a think tank that ranks it as a top investor, then uses that ranking to sponsor a newsletter touting the award. All of this is also happening with little substantive disclosure. Politico allowed Amazon to push that ad in its journalistic newsletter without caring to say whether the company funded the think tank that created the award it was advertising. That's crazy. And why is Amazon advertising its support for a $15 minimum wage in Beltway publications? Because, as the Texas Public Policy Foundation notes, Amazon could absorb the blow much more easily than its competitors, so supporting the policy is a feel-good move that generates easy public relations at little to no cost. It's a clever way for a corrupt corporation to make Washington feel better about supporting it, and consumers feel better about patronizing it. The saga is illustrative of the way powerful interests purchase and exert outsized influence in Washington, the way media allows it to happen, and the way big business ideology is deeply entrenched in the political establishment. Ryan, it is a good example of how Amazon is able to sort of amplify pro-Amazon positions at cost to anti-Amazon positions. So they can just keep paying think tanks and newsletters then to let them advertise the think tank's award, and that has the effect of amplifying this pro-Amazon message they have resources that anti-Amazon arguments don't.
Yeah, it's one of the most absurd examples I've seen, and you said it well. They fund an organization that gives them an award, and then they pay a news organization to tell the whole city that they won this award.
Right.
It's just completely insane. The part I'd quibble with is the idea that PPI even has an ideology. So, like, if you are a corporate-funded think tank, okay, at some point, the people that you have hired came to some ideological conclusion that kind of this corporate neoliberalism is a good thing, or they decided that they're willing to, say that for money. But if new funding came in that said, you know what, we don't actually support this anymore. Now we support these positions. Mm-hmm. Either that think tank changes its ideology and does the new thing that they're told to do, or they lose all of their money and a new think tank comes up that's called the Super Progressive Policy Institute, and then puts forward this new ideology. And so, we talk a lot about democracy being a way to like act on the will of the people, but we don't talk enough about the production of that will.
Right.
Like how do you produce the will of the people? And Amazon is out there producing the will by creating think tanks or funding think tanks and then spreading the word of those think tanks around the city in a way that can't really be described as democratic, because how can a democratic process parse these things out if at the back end you're telling them what they think to begin with? Right.
It's not purely bottom up, as we sometimes like to think. And actually, and a lot of that is cultural, coming from the top down. What's so interesting about your point on PPI is that our ruling class's ideology is increasingly just money. Because if you look at Jack Dorsey, this is a fascinating example as well. Jack Dorsey donated tons of money to Ibram X. Kendi, who is an avowed anti-capitalist and believes that capitalism is tethered inextricably to racism. That makes no sense from Jack Dorsey. His ideology in that case was pro-Twitter, pro-Jack Dorsey, pro-public relations, and that's essentially, at the end of the day, pro-money. And so I think, to the extent they have an ideology, I think they would sit down and have sincere conversations in favor of big business with us. And I think their ideology is simply maintaining the establishment's grip on power and money.
Right. And ideology without financial backing or without a social base is meaningless. It's just a person with an opinion. And so these economists might actually, and probably very much do, believe what they're saying, but they don't have a social base. We know that as a fact. And so it's only the financing behind them that enables them to be part of the public conversation. And in my book, I told this anecdote about Nancy Pelosi. Before she would meet with a trade group, she'll take out Roll Call, The Hill, and Politico, which are the newspapers that go around Capitol Hill, and she'd thumb through them and see if the group that she's meeting has full-page ads and how many full-page ads they had. And that was a signal then to the rest of the power structure of how much money they're bringing to bear and how much power they're bringing to bear, which then is a gauge for how seriously they're supposed to be taken on Capitol Hill. Oh, 2 full-page ads in each one of these newspapers? All right, they're really swinging here. So I better listen.
That's incredible reporting and a really important anecdote, because it shows that sometimes it's really easy for consumers to scroll past the ads and it's like, well, I'm not stupid. I know that this is an ad. It's supposed to look like news, but I know it's an ad. But they actually are important. They are valued, and people sort of perceive them, and they know that. And that's why
the fact of the ad is more important than the message itself.
Right, because it is a signal of money and a signal of power, and that is such an important point. The whole thing is the newsletter GRIFT is an incredible one.
Well, I used to co-write a newsletter for HuffPost. It was called HuffPost Hill. And one week, bizarrely, Goldman Sachs decided it was going to sponsor it. And because we were doing the production as well, we learned, Goldman Sachs is the one doing the ads. This is 2009 when Goldman Sachs is despised today. Multiply that by 1,000 in 2009. So we rewrote the whole day's newsletter, just trashing Goldman Sachs, top to bottom. Brought to you each segment brought to you by Goldman Sachs. Just like the poverty that you're experiencing, just like the foreclosure crisis. It actually made some news in D.C. at the time, and I'm kind of surprised I didn't lose my job, because that's a crazy thing to do, and newsletters around Washington can't sustain themselves if they do that. We did not have any more weeks of Goldman Sachs advertising, as you can imagine.
Oh no, but it is funny because it reminds me of what you said earlier in that, like, what is the ideology of PPI, and it's people who have probably come through Goldman and ultimately work at Goldman today, probably. And it's funny because it's like, I honestly think someday we're going to see copies of like Marx printed by Goldman Sachs when they realize that it's like good advertisement for them. They'll be like, yeah,
sure,
stamp Goldman Sachs on it, we're good to go.
Sure, totally. Especially if we can divide the opposition.
Yeah, exactly. And heighten the contradiction. So that's Lenin. Well, Team Rising is next.